Good morning and welcome to the 9th meeting of the COVID-19 committee. We have one item on our agenda this morning, looking at options for easing the coronavirus lockdown restrictions, and we'll be taking evidence from two panels of witnesses. For our first evidence session, we are joined by Scottish Government officials, Dr. Gregor Smith, who is Interim Chief Medical Officer for Scotland, Professor David Crossman, who is the Chief Scientist Health, and Professor Roger Halliday, the Chief Statistician and the Joint Head of COVID Modelling and Analysis team. So I'd like to welcome all three to our meeting this morning. Thank them for their time. I'm asking members if they can, when they're asking their questions, if they can indicate which of our panellists they want to answer that question. And if any of the panellists want to bring in a colleague, if they just say that at that point, and that'll allow broadcasting a chance to switch on the appropriate microphones. And if I can just remind both members and witnesses just to take a pause before they answer the question to allow broadcasting time to switch on the microphones. Now, I believe that each of the witnesses will explain very briefly what their role is. So I'll start by bringing in Dr. Gregor Smith, please, to explain his position.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the invite to provide evidence to you today. So my name is Gregor Smith. I'm the Interim Chief Medical Officer for Scotland. I've fulfilled that role since the beginning of April. Before that, I was the Deputy Chief Medical Officer. The role of the Chief Medical Officer in Scotland is to provide and coordinate the clinical and public health advice both to our Scottish ministers, but also to our policy officials within Scotland. And we do that through a network of advisors, some of whom work directly for Scottish Government and some of whom are linked through NHS roles. That's a structure which has been augmented during the response to COVID-19, and we may touch upon how some of that advice is provided over the course of the questioning. I'm going to pass you to Professor David Crossman now, who's the Chief Scientist Health, and he'll outline what his role is within government too.
Good morning, everybody. Yes, I'm David Crossman, Chief Scientist Health. That role in non-COVID times predominantly works advising and leading the Chief Scientist Office, which is the office that oversees research, development and innovation within the NHS in Scotland. That means that I am predominantly research-facing, advise on health research matters, and that clearly there is a research interface with the whole COVID problem. I've been drawn into that in COVID times. My background is as a clinical scientist. I was a researcher, and for interest, I'm a cardiologist. Thank you.
Thank you. And Professor Halliday, please.
So my role in the government is the Chief Statistician for Scotland. So I'm responsible for the numbers that come out of public sector organisations and responsible for their trustworthiness, their quality and their impact. I'm also the Interim Chief Executive of an organisation called Research Data Scotland, which helps organisations to access securely data for the public good. And I'm also taken on the role as the head of the Scottish Government's COVID modelling and analysis team. And the role of that team is to support decision making in government and the wider public sector by developing models that show the potential path of COVID in different circumstances, to help planning, but also evaluation of policy options.
Okay, thank you very much. It's very helpful just to understand the respective roles of the witnesses. I wonder if I can start the questions. I'll start by directing the first two questions to Gregor Smith, and then please, if you want to bring your colleagues in, please just do so. We are focusing this morning on the issue of easing the coronavirus lockdown restrictions. You only have to switch on a television or a radio or pick up a newspaper to see how much public interest there is in this and the speed at which this is progressing. And there's a lot of discussion around all the different factors at play here, the R number, the number of cases in hospital at the moment, the number of infection cases in the general population, the success of the test and trace initiative. I think what the committee is interested in trying to understand is to what extent are decisions about relaxing restrictions and moving on from, for example, phase 1, phase 2, or subsequent phases. To what extent are these driven purely by the science, or are they ultimately just political considerations? I think if you can try and give us an understanding of that, that would be very helpful.
So the basis of why these restrictions are in place is the restrictions that we've all been living with for many, many weeks now are designed to try to protect us from the harmful effects of COVID-19, the disease that the SARS-CoV-2 virus causes. And those restrictions are designed to try to provide separation from each other in a way that prevents the virus from transmitting to each other. And so one of the things we've done successfully over that time is to be able to suppress the spread of that virus. And we know that because there's various data streams that we monitor to kind of see exactly what the current state of spread and illness across the country is. And Roger might want to touch upon some of the models that we use that in a little second. But if that's the reason why the restrictions are in place, then we need to be very, very clear that actually, as we start to change those restrictions, as we start to evolve our approach, the purpose still has to remain that we change that approach in a way that's safe to the population, that we make sure that with each change that we apply, that the impact of that doesn't cause the virus to allow it to be able to spread again. And one of the points that I want to get across to the committee is that the margins in that are rather tight. You're right, we've all become familiar with the R number now. It's something that probably very few of us spoke about on a regular basis prior to this, but I think we've all become rather expert in what the R number is and what the current state of play is, not only in Scotland but in places across the world as well. But that R number is important because what it tells us is how that virus has the potential to transmit across our communities. It's not taken in isolation. It's a useful measurement, but it's not taken in isolation because what we also have to take into account is the number of infectious cases that we have at any one time as well, what the burden of disease, if you like, is within our communities as well, because that tells you actually what the potential for that spread is within the country as well. And the more infectious people we have, the more likely it is that if the R number starts to rise, then we'll start to get into those kind of exponential growth rates that we've seen in late March and the early part of April again. And we want to guard against that because the margins are very, very small. And for some time now, we've been seeing a sustained and stabilising effect in those numbers so that we can become increasingly confident that changing the restrictions is not going to allow that rapid growth of the number of cases again. But we really need to, and this is where I've urged caution all along, is that we really need to take those steps very, very carefully and assess their impact before moving on to do anything too quickly. One of the worst things that we could do after enduring these restrictions for so many weeks is move too quickly at this point in time and find that we lose control of the transmissions within our community and that we start to see that growth in the disease, the growth in the number of infectious cases, and of course the pressures that brings upon services to be able to respond in a way that is helpful as well. So in my view, the advice that has been provided at all times has been to make sure that we use the science to help to guide us out of that we use the data that's available to us to help to make those decisions in a timely way, but at all times it's with the purpose of making sure that we try to preserve the public health of the population.
Thank you very much. Just to follow up on that, as you mentioned the R number, and I know a number of my colleagues want to pursue issues around the R number in a bit more detail, and we'll get onto that in a moment. But we have obviously moved to phase 1 of the relaxation of restrictions. the First Minister will be making a statement next week as to whether or not at that point we can move on to phase 2. Where does the R number have to be, in your view, before we can safely move on to the next phase?
So in my view, the R number, I would certainly prefer the R number to be stable. And if it's stable and improving, then that's even better. But in terms of absolute numbers, what we're looking for often is if you like, a range that R appears in rather than an actual point number. And over time, we can see trends developing in that R number that allow us to, as I say, to get a sense as to whether we're in a stable picture with declining number of infections. It's important, as I say, that R is taken in the context that it's not R alone that we would use to make those decisions. R is important, but it's R in the context of the pool of infectious cases that we have across the country and how those cases are impacting on services as well. Professor Halliday might want to say a little bit more about that and some of the modelling work that he's done that helps to inform these decisions. But what we can actually do is for any changes that we begin to shape and to propose, we can start to calculate through the models that we work through, the experience that we're seeing in other countries, some of the impacts that they potentially may have, both on the R number itself, but also potentially on the pool of infected cases as well.
Professor Halliday, do you want to contribute at this point?
I think there are a couple of things to say. First of all, in terms of the assessment that we make on looking at each individual option. And so...
Attention all staff. Attention all staff.
Thank you, Gaurav.
Sorry, apologies, Professor Halliday. Just carry on.
So, looking at... So Gregor mentioned earlier on about looking at different options that we've got for easing restrictions. And so that's what my team's looked at, many different options, and particularly looked at our role is assessing what the impact on the R number would be, or an increased transmission. And the ways that we've done that are to, first of all, look at what other countries have done. And that is that we're tracking data from around 20 countries around the world. And we can look at their experience, look at what happened to the R number in those countries before they introduced an easement of different kinds. So, for example, we looked at what happens to opening schools in Denmark. We looked at what happened to opening construction in Spain, and a range of other things. And to do that, you need to have a gap either side of when that restriction was done, and you need to wait a few weeks to make sure that you see the effects. But we can do that for some of the things that we're looking at, and that gives a pretty good signal. Where we can't do that, we are also part of the UK network linked to the SAGE committee, and a particular committee on modelling called SPI-M. That has expert models from around the UK that are looking at various interventions and the impact of those, and particularly we've looked at around schools and used the expertise around the UK on that. And then when neither of those things is available, what we've ultimately done is look at some of the key drivers for transmission. And there are 5 drivers for transmission rate that we'd look at, 2 related to scale. So the first thing is kind of how many people are changing their behaviour under an option, whether it's just a few people and that would be doing something differently or a lot. And then for those people that are changing behaviour, how many people would they come into contact with? If it's not very many, then that's a good thing. And then there are 3 drivers that we look at that are related to the transmission of COVID by an individual that are important. The first one is the intensity of any contact that people have with somebody else. So we know that transmission is much higher if people stay within 2 meters of somebody else for more than 15 minutes, for example. We know that transmission is much higher indoors than it is outdoors. And so that's important when we're looking at things in particular like travel to work or travel to school or travel to an activity. And then the final thing is we know that COVID is often transmitted through touching with communal surfaces. So we're assessing the extent to which each of these 5 drivers applies to a particular option. And then I'm working with colleagues across government who are looking at other harms that are related to COVID, so sort of other non-COVID health issues, societal issues, and economic issues, and looking at the benefits of opening up, of choosing particular options to ease restrictions. And I guess that then put that collective advice forward to ministers.
Okay, thank you, Professor Halliday. I've got Stuart Stevenson wants to come in with a supplementary, and I'll bring him in a second, but if I could just ask one final follow-up question, Professor Halliday. We have, across the 4 nations of the UK, slightly different approaches now to relaxing lockdown, and other parts of the UK are probably taking a more liberal approach than we have so far in Scotland. How actively are you following what's happening elsewhere in the UK and learning from their experience and using that information to help ministers here take decisions about the impact of relaxing restrictions?
Certainly looking at what's happening in other parts of the UK, and like I say, we're working with scientific advisors through the SAGE and SPY and committees. One thing that I mentioned that's important here is that in order to really see the signal that something that there's an effect on the R value or an effect of a particular easing, you need two things to be happening. One is that you need, in order to know that the effect was down to a particular thing, you need nothing else to be happening for a week either side of that. The second thing that you need is to wait for around about 3 weeks for that to happen. So obviously we're looking across the UK, but some of the changes that are happening across the UK don't meet either of those criteria. So it's difficult to see the effect on the R value of that. What we're also doing is, I guess, looking at the things, as Gregor Smith mentioned earlier on, looking at indicators both here in Scotland and elsewhere at the number of cases, the number of admissions to hospital, and the number of deaths from COVID, and other indicators too, to get an assessment of what's parts of the UK.
Thank you. Stuart Stevenson, please, and after Stuart's questions, we'll go to Monica Lennon.
Thank you, Convener. Dr. Gregor Smith referred to experience in other countries, and we've just been listening to Roger Halliday, to whom my supplementary is directed, talk about looking at what's going on in 20 other countries. I have a personal interest because I have a nephew who's a senior teacher in Denmark, and I have people in other countries in Sweden, Australia, and the United States who are relatives. But I particularly wanted to understand, as a lay person, I stress, of course, how we normalise the data that are coming from other countries, how we make sure that it's actually telling us the same story, because we do know that things are counted and allocated in different ways in different countries. And the reason I ask that is, to what extent is looking at other countries helping the policymakers and the ministers make decisions that are based on other countries' experience? Because, of course, if the data isn't comparable because it hasn't been properly normalised, we will make false decisions. So if I could just have a quick layman's view of how we're trying to sort out the different ways different countries, it would equally apply to the jurisdiction of the UK, but I'm more interested.
Well, thank you for the question. So the first thing I would say is that I've drawn together a team of experts from across the public sector in Scotland, and also some academics that we're working with. The second thing that I would say is that what we're looking for internationally is a signal. And so the fact that, so first of all, we model on primarily using death data because it's the best, most comparable, and most consistent over time. And it's that consistency over time that's really important in order to understand the signal, because even though deaths might be counted in slightly different ways in different countries, the fact that they're counted in consistent ways is what's important for us understanding whether there's an effect of a certain easing of restriction.
That's it, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Sure. Okay, Monica Lennon, please, and after Monica, bring in Annabel Ewan.
Good morning, thank you, Convener, and good morning to our panel today. My first question is on the R number. You'll probably not be surprised about that. And I wondered, and perhaps Professor Halliday is the best person to answer initially, does the Scottish Government hold information on what the suspected R number is for different parts of Scotland, different regions? Is that information shared with local health boards or local authorities, for example? And is there any reason why that information couldn't be shared with the public?
Thank you for that question. So in calculating the R number, it's not straightforward. It uses statistical modelling to do that, and as such, there's the introduction of a level of uncertainty with the R number. In fact, we don't. My advice is not to class it as a number, but to class it, as Gregor Smith mentioned earlier on, as a range, which is currently between 0.7 and 0.9. So not a there's still a decent size of range there for Scotland. When you were to look at that for local areas of Scotland, because you're dealing in much smaller numbers, so for example, the Western Isles is fortunate not to have had a death from COVID, then actually the ranges are going to be really quite big. In fact, I would say that, and I would guess that the ranges are going to be so wide that actually it's, there's limited value in having an R number for different parts of Scotland. I think what we're much better to do is to use the data that we've got about the number of cases, the number of hospital admissions, and the number of deaths. And at this point, as the Chief Statistician, I need to say thank you to all my statistical colleagues that have really stepped up and started producing information on a much more regular basis. We publish daily figures now by Health Board, for example, on a whole range of statistics, and I think that's the place to start for examining what's going on around Scotland.
Thank you, Professor Halliday. I mean, it sounds like there's lots of data available, but you've said that there's still a degree of uncertainty, and I understand your point about a range being looked at rather than a definitive R number. Do you see a benefit in putting more of that information into the public domain so the public can understand how the virus is behaving in their own community? And do you think that could help with compliance or tolerance of the rules, but also give the public more opportunity to make judgments about their own behaviours in health, for example, being outdoors more, because the risk appears to be lower in outdoor spaces than in indoors?
Yeah, well, so I suppose my starting point is that we have published quite a lot of that information. We've published the data. I guess that there's, and we've published quite a bit of the scientific evidence that we've got, such as what you just mentioned there. In terms of publishing very local data, I think this is, well, we're currently examining this at the moment. I think that the challenge is that we've actually, thankfully now got quite small numbers of cases, of new hospital admissions, and of deaths, that if you were to drill down within a health board or a local authority area into very small areas, then the numbers, thankfully, are very small. And so we've got a challenge there, both in terms of privacy and in terms of the presentation of that data. So we're just examining how best to go about that at the moment.
Thank you. If I can move on to another aspect, there's been a lot of discussion about the 2 metre distance rule, and we raised that with the Cabinet Secretary, with Mike Russell, last week, raising some of the practical difficulties for workers and employers in maintaining a 2 metre distance. But there's, even in the last couple of days, been a lot of media coverage about what happens in other countries and the current thinking in Scotland and the UK. So can I ask, in terms of the science and the data that you have access to from around the world, why is there no consensus on whether it should be 2 metres or 1 metre? I don't have an exact list in front of me, but I know that in many countries they're looking at 1 metre or 1.4 or 1.5 metres. But why are we sticking rigidly to 2 metres here in Scotland? And in relation to all the different harms that you take account of, not just health, but also harms to the economy and people's jobs, perhaps Dr. Smith could advise on this point. Why do we feel that it's more cautious to stick to 2 metres when a lot of businesses are saying that they could basically be in big trouble, and there could be thousands of job losses in Scotland in hospitality, for example, and tourism, because people can't manage the 2 metre distance?
So thank you for your question, and I think it's really important that we address the risk that's associated with distancing as well, and as we speak about it, but also acknowledge that there are different types of harms that have arisen as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic across the world. Primarily, we've been focused, I think quite rightly, on making sure that we reduce the health harms which are associated with COVID-19, but we have to acknowledge as well that there are wider harms to society and to the economy as well as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic as well, and we don't take any of those lightly when we're providing advice. My role is to be able to provide the public health advice and the clinical advice that helps to shape our response as to why we should take a particular measure or a particular approach to try to reduce the potential for this to harm health more than any other aspect. And when we look at the 2 metre rule, you're right, there's a variety of different approaches which are taken around the world. The WHO recommends that we should take at least 1 metre, but the way that that's applied across the world, there's huge variation. One of the reasons for that variation is because it's not a simple equation that calculates the risk that's associated with this. So, for instance, the smaller the distance between people, the less time that you're able to spend within that distance before the risk of actually contracting COVID-19 becomes much greater. And when the advisory structures across the UK have considered this, the different elements which are at play in assessing that risk, so the actual physical distance between people, the time that people are likely to spend within that distance, but also the type of protection that they might have in an everyday scenario as well. All of those factors contribute to that overall assessment of risk. And the closer you are to someone, the greater that risk. That's the one aspect of this which is absolutely incontrovertible and known. If you have physical contact with someone, your risk is much greater than if you're at 1 metre, and if you're at 1 metre, your risk is much greater than if you're at 2 metres. So when these have been taken into account and assessed together, the advice from the UK advisory groups has been that the best balance to provide the adequate levels of safety and reduced transmission between people is that the UK should adopt the 2 metre distance rule in that respect. And I think that this is a balanced and sensible precaution to make sure that we are reducing the risk of the transmission of this virus between people. As soon as you start to reduce that distance any further, the closer you get to that 1 metre, the less time that you're able to spend within that without the possibility of being able to transmit this virus. We have to remember that behind this is a virus which is highly transmissible. It's probably more transmissible by the data that we have so far than influenza. Certainly, all the kind of data that I've read in this would suggest that. And it's a virus which is particularly highly transmissible because so few of us have ever had come into contact with it. And my view is that if we were to reduce that 2 metre distance based on the evidence that we have just now, then there would be a much greater risk of that virus transmitting between more people at this point in time.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. I'm just looking at the list of some of the countries who do apply the 1 metre rule: China, Denmark, France, Hong Kong, Lithuania, Singapore, and that's in line with WHO advice. So are they getting it wrong, or are they getting different advice? And I totally respect that your role is to advise on public health matters. But can you give us some insight in terms of advice to the First Minister, who provides that advice in terms of economic impact? Because for those businesses who just simply can't maintain 2 metre distances, coffee shops, bars and so on, restaurants, if they go out of business, that will have a huge impact on people's jobs and on the economy, and that will also lead to public health harm. So in terms of that balance of harms, where does the economic advice come from?
So I guess I should confine myself to commenting on the specific public health and clinical advice that is given to ministers, and obviously they receive advice on other aspects of government from other advisors as well. And as you may be aware that there's a network of chief advisors across government, including the chief economic advisor, who no doubt has been giving advice on a regular basis to ministers as well through this. But as I say, I would only want to confine myself to the public health and clinical advice that has been given to ministers. And the way that that's delivered, as I say, is within the UK. We've got an advisory structure which is able to examine the evidence from around the world in the UK and make a judgment on that. That's primarily through the SAGE network of groups, which includes a variety of different subgroups, which all examine different aspects of the response to COVID-19. But these are primarily focused on the public health and clinical aspects as to why we should adopt a particular approach. WHO recommends a minimum of 1 metre space, but also acknowledges within that guidance that actually the lower the spacing between people, the greater the risk that there is as well. And I think quite rightly we've adopted an approach which minimises the health harms to the country.
Thank you.
Thank you to Monica. Thank you, Dr. Smith. We'll move on, please, to Annabel Ewing, and after Annabel, it will be Adam.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, colleagues on the panel. Just picking up on that last point, I take from what Dr. Smith said that the closer you are, the greater the risk. The closer you are, the less time, if you like, you can spend that close without the risk increasing significantly. And therefore, I would ask, in that context, as we're talking about easing lockdown, presumably the worst thing for all of us, including for our economy, would be to have to go into a second significant lockdown. And so does that also inform the decision-making processes on this issue and indeed on many of the other issues? Perhaps Dr. Smith could respond to that.
So again, thank you for your question, and I guess it follows on from the conversation that we've just had there. One of the things that we are trying to do, and I've tried to do from the beginning, is to reduce the number of bridges of transmission. And one of the ways that we've done that is by introducing these lockdown measures. Now, this is obviously a huge impact on society, but what it does is it reduces our contact with other people and therefore reduces the opportunity for this virus to pass from one person to the other. So that's one extreme version of the distancing which we put in place to try to suppress the spread of the virus. And you're right when you assert that actually the closer we come to each other, the more likely it is that that virus spreads. And there is a very real possibility that as we begin to exit this current arrangement that we have with the restrictions that are in place, that if we go too far too fast, and if we create too many bridges for this virus to begin to cross between people again, then what we will start to see is we will start to see more cases developing, we will start to see the R number rise, and there will be more opportunities within our communities for this virus to spread to other people. Now, if we do that at the same time as people are actually closer physically to each other, then clearly you can see how we would start to get into an area where more restrictive measures would have to be considered again in order to suppress that virus. I want to get across the point very, very carefully that actually this is a highly transmissible infection. The closer we are to each other, the more easily it will spread to other people. When we look at the way that the patterns of spread around the country, one of the key characteristics that we can see with this virus is that where people are closer together, where people congregate, particularly in enclosed spaces, the more likely it is to be able to spread from one person to the next. And what we want to try to do is we want to try to clearly to avoid that and to make sure that we reduce the chances of us having to reintroduce any more restrictive measures again in the future.
I thank Dr. Smith for that answer. Another question I have is the issue of the K number. The First Minister referred indeed to that yesterday at the briefing, and it would be helpful, I think, for the public if somebody, I'll direct it to Dr. Smith, but he can feel free to involve his colleagues, if somebody could explain in layman's terms what the K number is, but also very importantly what significance this measurement could have in terms of tackling the pandemic and further easing lockdown.
So again, this is a real area of emerging interest, if you like, is the K number. We're introducing new terms to the kind of country's lexicon all the time. I'll probably bring Professor Crossman in a second so he can say a little bit more. But essentially, when we're assessing the K number, what we're looking at is the potential for the virus to spread to other people from if you like, a low number of people. What we know from the way that infectious disease spreads is that not everybody will spread to the same extent. And with this virus, we know that some people actually don't spread the virus very easily at all. However, there are a few people who seem to be responsible for a high degree of spread, and that's where the K number comes in, because it allows us to assess and express that transmissibility. And probably what we see is that between 10 and 15% of people are perhaps responsible for up to 80% of the spread of this particular virus, what we call super spreading events. And we know that there are particular characteristics, probably physical characteristics of the location, which make that much more likely. So I've already mentioned that it's much more likely to spread in enclosed spaces, when people are in close proximity, when there's lots of hard surfaces around about us. These are the type of environments when we know that that K number is going to be optimised to be able to kind of spread from one person to many people. Professor Crossman might want to say a little bit more about it, but that essentially looks at this concept that actually a small number of people might be responsible for a great deal of the transmission that we see across the communities. Professor Crossman.
Thank you, Gregor. So K is yet another number that we can hang on to measure spread, but it's looking, as the CMO has said, at analysing clusters. Now, I'll just sort of slightly rewind some of the discussion. Because I think a point that has been slightly underemphasised is where we are in the epidemic in Scotland. Clearly, when lockdown was introduced, we were in a bad place, and it was at the height of the epidemic, and measures had to be put in, which have worked, and they saved lives, and they protected the NHS, as the expression goes, and they were successful in that term. We're now, because of those restrictions, in the I don't know if you want to use the tail word, but we're in a much better place, and I think it is a bit of a tail, because if you look at the new incident numbers and the deaths and things, they are sort of trickling along now, and that's what happens in epidemics. But actually, what you do changes from that managing the accelerating part of the curve and the eye-watering numbers of cases and deaths, let us not forget, to actually something that is more containable. And what you're doing at this stage is, and the question's absolutely spot on, you are trying to stop this re-escalating, a rebound, a second wave or whatever. But in the context of this question, we're talking about a second wave coming from indigenous, local, remaining disease in that tail, not new introductions from abroad or anything else. We're talking about what we've got in Scotland. Can it explode again? And and understanding that and managing that is going to be different. And of course, it also brings in the issue of balances of other risks. At the height of the epidemic, the model has been very biomedical, for sake of a better description. It's been all about infection and so on and so forth. And the economic, social and educational issues have been slightly to one side. But that as you manage this tail bit, clearly those become much more important because of the issue of how long it's going to go on for. But in relation to the issue that is the substance of this question, measuring what are outbreaks becomes the important thing, rather than perhaps the R number, because the R number will lag, I suppose, for sake of better description. And going back to what I was saying at the height of the epidemic, remember January, there were a few cases, and we were wondering how it was going to be, and so on and so forth. And it took weeks for the signal to appear and for us to realise how this was going to affect Scotland and the United Kingdom. We're in this position again, and there are very few early warning signs. In fact, I think it would be fair to say that, examining clusters is about it, really, and that's why it's important. Coming back to the question about R number is the envelope for the whole of Scotland. It has to look at linked communities that do, and that's one reason why you don't reduce it and reduce it and reduce it. There has to be a link between the people. But we are now in this situation where we will have an R number bumbling along because it says that you're in the tail of the epidemic, but it won't spring up quickly. But what we might see is clusters. We might see that's measured by this this variation of distribution, telling you about clustering and about outbreak. But I think it's the context of the important message I want to get over is the context is where we are in the epidemic cycle, which I think changes the approach. So we go from lockdown to trace and protect, for example. It changes the way we measure it. We perhaps don't obsess so much on R. We look at other measures like incident cases, K, various other measures that you can look at in society, and those are some of those are research based, and of course it changes the balance, the judgment that the politicians have to make. Our science can only take us so far about the other risks that Gregor and others have alluded to. So quite a long answer, and I hope it also adds to some of the other questions. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Annabelle. We'll move on to Adam Tompkins, please, and after Adam, it'll be Willie Coffey.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you, everyone. I want to ask how you calibrate the health harms that are being directly caused by lockdown itself in terms of the advice that you give to ministers about the appropriate balance to strike between the health harms of COVID and the health harms of the response to COVID. And in particular, how do you calibrate and what weight do you give to the mental health and mental well-being harms that are being directly caused by this prolonged lockdown?
Adam, who's that question to first?
Well, whoever's most appropriate. I mean, I could start with Gregor.
Thank you, Mr. Tompkins. Thanks for that question. I mean, I think it's a really good question because it's something which is on our minds fairly constantly in terms of the balance between those different harms. I think there are four main harms that we would want to consider in this context. There's the direct and the indirect health harms that you've alluded to, but there's also the harms to society and the harms to the economy, all of which may have an indirect impact on health as well. So all of those elements have to be taken into account when we are faced with how we present advice to ministers in terms of our approach. We've known that the most pressing harm has clearly been the harm from the virus itself, particularly during the period through March and the early part of April, when it was very clear that the potential for this virus to cause really quite marked and serious illness and, as we've already said, many deaths was very much there and was the obvious harm which we had to address very quickly, and that necessitated the extreme actions that were put into effect. But of course, the longer you have those extreme actions in place, the more likely there are harms which will begin to mount from other sources. And one of the harms we've been keeping a fairly close eye on, of course, is the harms from the non-direct health consequences, particularly of some services which we have taken perhaps for granted within the NHS being paused to allow the overall response to COVID. I was struck very early on by the response of the population and the public to this in particular. And although emergency and urgent services were still in place within the NHS, the early data that particularly caused me concern was perhaps people not presenting with urgent conditions in the way that we would expect them to do. And we saw that there was a fall-off in both emergency department attendances, but also attendance to GPs for some potentially serious health conditions, such as symptoms that we would normally associate with cancer, such as symptoms of heart attacks and of stroke as well. And so it became very clear that there was a rising risk that people were could suffer serious harm as a result of that. And we monitor that over time, both in terms of the management data that we have access to within the NHS, but also some of the outcome data as well through the deaths reporting that we have as well. You'll no doubt have noted the marked campaigns that we have to make sure that people were still using the NHS in that way. We also have to turn our attention to, as I say, those perhaps less obvious harms that people experience, particularly the distress, the emotional distress, and the effects on people's mental health that they have. And that's why we've put in place many different avenues for people to kind of seek help, because we recognise that particularly for some, being isolated and being under these kind of lockdown restrictions is an incredible burden for them to bear. So there's a range of new services which have been put in place to try to support people like that, and I suspect that we will need those services in place for some time afterwards to deal with the recovery period as we start to kind of come out of this immediate response as well. One of the areas which we also have to keep and pay quite close attention to is if the country does suffer longer term economic harm as a consequence of the response, which seems likely. It seems certainly that that's the picture which is emerging globally, is that countries will experience that. It's often a time when health inequalities are widened as well, and we know that COVID-19 already has had quite a significant impact on people experiencing those health inequalities, and that might be accentuated and amplified in the future as well. So we have teams of public health consultants who are looking at that closely to try to offer guidance and advice as to the potential harms that we need to try to mitigate there as well.
That's very helpful, and I'm grateful for that. But I want to drill down into it in a little bit more detail, because a number of us, I think, are increasingly concerned that our reaction to COVID is disproportionate, that lockdown is going on for too long, and that we are being too slow in coming out of it because, and this is revealed, I think, in a lot of the language that you've used today, Dr. Smith, that those in the evaluation as to what is safe to do, the dice are being loaded, inadvertently perhaps, but the dice are being loaded. So one of the things that you said in a response to an earlier answer is that we have to reduce COVID health harms and we have to acknowledge other health harms. Well, why is that? Why don't we have to reduce other health harms as well as reducing COVID health harms? Why is it good enough just to acknowledge that there are other harms going on? Perhaps it's best to talk about this not in the general but in the particular. So let's go back to the particular of 2 meters versus 1 meter. We know that hundreds, perhaps thousands of hospitality businesses will not be able to make ends meet if their customers have to be separated by 2 meters, but will be able to make ends meet if their customers have to be separated by only 1 meter. We know, as you've just said, that significant unemployment causes significant health harms. Unemployment is not only an economic problem, it's a health problem. So how do you calibrate that in the advice that you are giving to ministers, and what weight do you put on the ongoing mental health harms that are being directly caused by a very severe lockdown and a very slow escape from that lockdown?
So just to add to that, we know. So the first step in identifying and being able to address any potential risk or any harm is, first of all, to acknowledge that, because once you've acknowledged that, you're then able to introduce things which try to mitigate the risk of that harm actually taking place. And what we know from this virus, of course, Mr. Tompkins, is that it is very real that the closer people are together, the more likely it is to transmit. So the evidence again suggests very, very clearly to us all that the way to mitigate that risk is to ensure that the distancing is appropriate to reduce that risk to acceptable levels. And in the same way that we do that, we also assess the harms potential from other things, whether that be from non-attendance at EDs, whether that be from the potential societal harms that are happening, and mitigation strategies are developed to try to reduce the risk of those occurring. And there is a very fine balancing act between those cumulative risks that society faces from the variety of different harms which this COVID disease can cause, which need to be balanced in the advice. And I accept your point that that advice needs to be balanced, but I also assure you that all these things are taken into consideration and assessed in the round so that that balanced advice can be given to ministers, not just from myself as a clinical and public health advisor, but also from the range of different advisors that are in place across government to make sure that their perspectives are heard and considered by ministers as well.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Tompkins. We'll move on to Willie Coffey, please, and after Willie, I'll bring in Ross Greer. Can I just say to our witnesses, we've had some very detailed answers, and it's important because there's a lot of detail in this we want to get out, but we are a little bit behind the clock, so slightly shorter answers would be helpful, just to allow members all an opportunity to ask the questions they want. Willie Coffey, please.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning, everybody. I wanted to ask a question about the shielded group. The management of the pandemic and the science has led us to relax the lockdown for most of the population, but not for the shielded group. We announced just the other day that lockdown extension is really the 31st of July. My question is, how can the science allow us an easing up of the lockdown for a group of the population, but not for the shielded group in the population? Isn't that the science doing different things at the same time?
Shall I take this?
Yeah,
I think it's a really important question, because I think that the shielded group has borne some of the heaviest burdens of the restrictions that have been in place, and those burdens have not just been physical, but clearly they've been emotional and mental as well. And so it's really important that group know that they're not forgetting about, and that the science is still working to try to make sure that we change those restrictions that they're experiencing as soon as we possibly can safely do so. And that's the key point here, Mr. Coffey, is that it needs to be safely done. So when we look at the infectious pool within Scotland, as it has been and as it is just now, and as we look at the models to see how that projects forward, there's a fine assessment that needs to be made for these most vulnerable people within our communities, to say to them that it's actually safe for them to start to kind of go outside again. And these decisions are not taken lightly. Fortunately, we have a widespread networks of clinical advisors who are able to advise us on these matters. And for instance, in relation to shielding, our clinical guidance cell has been offering us advice and guidance as to how we manage the extreme vulnerability that some of these groups face with the prevailing epidemiology and case mix of cases that we see across communities just now. And what we're assessing at this point in time is that with the current infectious pool that we have across Scotland, what we envisage is that by this point in the 18th of June, the models suggest that it'll have got to a stage where we can start to kind of recommend that people can start to go outside again. We know that the outdoors environment is a much safer environment as far as transmission is concerned. It's perhaps not safe enough yet to be able to say that we can start meeting other people properly socially distanced just yet, but we'll keep that under review, and I would expect that over the course of July that we'll be able to make further recommendations as that wider illness pool starts to shrink. The other important aspect of this as well is that we've made some changes over the last 2 to 3 weeks now. As Professor Halliday has already said, we need to make sure that we've assessed those changes and not had an unintended effect by making those changes, and that actually case numbers have grown again, because for me it would be reckless to recommend to our most vulnerable group in society to start going outside again if actually what we have is a picture of rising number of cases. Over.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Smith. My only follow-up to that, Convener, is just to ask, can we envisage dedicated time slots, perhaps, for our shielded community to allow them to access, country paths and walkways and so on at particular times of the day? I know that they're doing this in Ireland, and local communities there are respecting that, and it's really been a great boost for the shielded communities there to know that they can get out safely and walk in the countryside and know that they're protected in doing that. Is that something you think we could do in Scotland?
What we're looking at over the kind of coming weeks and just now is we're working with groups across the UK to try and give a much more tailored advice to people who are shielding, so that they can assess their risk in a way that actually meets their own approach to risk as well. So tailored advice that allows them to make a judgment as to what's the prevailing circumstances in their neighbourhoods that would allow them to make a judgment about how to go about their everyday life. And I think it's that tailored, that individual information to allow people to assess their own risk, which is going to become really important in allowing those people who are shielding much more freedom of movement and to be able to make these decisions with the agency that they need to regain.
Okay, thank you for that. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you, Willie. Move on to Ross Greer, please, and after Ross will be Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Convener. This is primarily a question for Dr. Smith. I'm interested in asymptomatic individuals, and by that I'm including people who are pre-symptomatic as well for the purposes of the question. There was a study of the outbreak on the Diamond Princess, the cruise liner, that found that half of the passengers who tested positive on that ship were asymptomatic at the point they were tested. Last week there was a review published of 16 groups of COVID patients around the world, and it found that at least 30% and more likely up to 45% of cases could be traced back to people who spread the virus without ever knowing that they were infected. So this is increasingly being described by scientists, including in what I've just mentioned, as being the Achilles heel. Asymptomatic transmission is the Achilles heel of current strategies across the world to suppress the virus. There was an Imperial College study that said routine testing could reduce infections by up to a third. Now in Scotland, we've got what appears to have been around 900 patients and 900 staff who've caught this disease in Scottish hospitals. If we've been routinely testing NHS staff, so those are asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic, how many of the deaths that are potentially associated with these in-hospital transmissions do you believe could have been prevented?
So thank you for your question. It's an area of huge scientific debate just now, and perhaps we'll bring Professor Crossman into this discussion as well. But the whole issue of asymptomatic or polysymptomatic spread is one where there is still very divided scientific opinion. On balance, I think that it is the evidence is accumulating for it that there is potentially a period, perhaps in the 24, maybe 48 hours before people become symptomatic, that there is the potential for spread in that time. But the majority of asymptomatic people will be asymptomatic carriers without shedding virus, or so it seems. And even at the beginning of this week, I noticed that the WHO were restating their view that actually asymptomatic spread was a rare event, as I say. So that probably emphasises to you the uncertainty that still exists within this area. And my own view is that there is the potential for spread. I think that this is accumulating evidence that is building that suggests in that immediately symptomatic period, that people may begin to shed virus to an extent that makes the transmissibility much more likely at that point. As I say, Professor Crossman may want to come in with some more of the science that sits behind that. But that's why increasingly over the response to the pandemic, we've started to build in more and more elements that looks at how testing on an asymptomatic basis might contribute to the overall response. So, for instance, the testing of asymptomatic care home workers to see whether that reveals any people that should be given specific advice about how they should proceed with work and exclude themselves. But as I say, Professor Crossman might want to come in a little bit more with the science, which at this moment in time certainly appears to be split as to what the case for asymptomatic spread is.
So, thanks very much, CMO, and thanks for the question. Gosh, this is topical. And it sounds slightly sort of pedantic, but a distinction here. There are some people who will remain asymptomatic throughout, and they will only be identified by having an antibody test, and they'll say, golly, I didn't know I'd been ill. And they're asymptomatic cases. And the evidence, and that's what the WHO were referring to, and I think that the data that are accumulating support WHO's position that they aren't super spreaders. They probably don't shed much virus, and say they're not to worry about is probably overstating it, but they're different. What we're talking about in the context of your question is somebody who doesn't think they're unwell but will be about to come unwell identifiable through testing to protect people. And that's the issue of, do you test people who are asymptomatic? Why are you doing that? There's nothing you can do for the individual. This is about protecting others. So if they work in a hospital, if they work in a care home, arguably if they live with the elderly, certainly if they live with a shielded individual, you could make that case. So that's the case for testing asymptomatic people. The question and your choice of figures for the Diamond Princess, absolutely interesting, but it takes me back to my original point. That was early on in the epidemic when this was exploding. And I think, if I'm remembering rightly, about 60% of the people on the Diamond Princess were swab positive. If you went into an asymptomatic group or asymptomatic ship, if there was one now, it would be single figures, very, very low figures. And the utility of testing when you get to very, very low cases brings in all the issues of the fidelity of the test, whether you're getting incorrect positives, incorrect negatives, and so on and so forth. So again, the balance of the judgment as to whether you do it changes where you are in the epidemic curve, and it is a very fine choice. If you were to do asymptomatic testing, my advice, having read the literature and talked to a lot of people about this, is you do that in terms of who they are going to be a risk to. And if you identify the population that are maximally risked, you can build the case for asymptomatic testing. It does, of course, bring the question then, how often do you then repeat the test? And there are very real complexities around that. And there isn't an agreed number for that, and there isn't science around how often you should do it, whether it's once a week, once a day, once every fortnight. I mean, it then becomes a matter of opinion on how often do you go on repeating. I'll stop there in the interest of time.
That's useful, thank you. To keep with that point though, you're making the correct point that when you're talking about asymptomatic testing, you need to consider who individuals are a risk to, which takes us back to this point of whether we should be routinely testing healthcare staff. And I accept Dr. Smith's point around the uncertainty around this. The evidence base is still growing. But to me, that would suggest that we should be adopting the precautionary principle here, that there is a body of evidence that suggests routine testing can reduce infection, can reduce transmission by up to a third. And we are routinely testing care workers, who are those who care for a vulnerable population. Well, so do healthcare workers. So if I could ask a specific question to Dr. Smith about the advisory group. The advisory group met on the 7th of May, and the minutes of that meeting noted that it discussed asymptomatic healthcare workers and asymptomatic transmission. And by that point, the first nosocomial review group meeting had also taken place. Could I then ask, are members of the Scottish Government's advisory group recommending routine testing of healthcare staff?
So the nosocomial group, which is, as you say, is a subgroup of the advisory group, is considering this matter at this very time. They are due to bring forward advice, and we expect that advice to be with ministers over the coming weeks. They're still examining all the evidence that's associated with it, but I am aware that they're about to bring forward advice, Mr. Greer.
Thank you. And then just one final question. Could you perhaps explain then what confusion's been caused by the fact that the government has already adopted a policy of routine testing for care staff, but not yet taken a position on routine testing of health staff? Could you explain why there's a difference between those two groups, and why it was possible to make a policy decision around care staff, but why a decision has still not been made and evidence is still being considered around health staff?
So the decision that was made around about care working staff was on the basis of a consideration that came through from the SAGE advisory group structure and their nosocomial and care homes groups.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you to Ross Greer. I'll move on to Beatrice Wishart, please, and after Beatrice, it'll be Shona Robeson. But Beatrice, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, panel. We've already touched on the sacrifice that the general population has made in terms of the lockdown and the harmful effects on individuals and also on the economy. And we know that some people are living in pain because planned operations and procedures haven't been able to go ahead. People with hip and knee problems, for example. And yesterday the Health Secretary said she was waiting for recommendations about further measures. I wonder if I could get an understanding of what further safety measures need to be put in place to get those routine operations underway again. That would be to Dr. Smith. Please.
Okay. So there's a variety of things which we need to make sure are in place to make sure that it's safe to begin those type of routine procedures as well. Some of those are in relation to making sure that we are ensuring that the immediate environment is optimised to make sure that any infection prevention control measures are all in place, that patients, as they are coming into hospital for their kind of treatments or for their surgery, there needs to be assessed in a way beforehand that makes sure that they are free of disease and that they're not going to be either developing disease whilst they're in hospital or potentially bringing further disease into hospital. So there's a variety of things that need to kind of be put fully into place just to make sure that those new pathways of care, which we're having to make sure are ready to receive kind of patients for the kind of routine work, are as safe as possible, so that we don't lead to kind of any unintended spread of COVID, either to them or to other individuals that they might be in contact with within hospital. And that work is all underway across Scotland just now, as the various health boards have submitted their remobilisation plans, and those that are in the process have been taken forward just now.
Thank you for that answer. Can I just change tack a little bit and talk about a possible, if there's a second wave of the virus that hits us, and I think the word explosion was used at one point earlier today about possible outbreaks. And if we got to that stage and we're looking at an outbreak in an area, would consideration be given to localised reinforcement of the lockdown restrictions that we have in place?
Again, will I take this question just now? It's what we're looking to do is to develop as much data as possible that informs decision making, and that decision making will largely be taken at a national level. But there may be some, in terms of outbreak management, there may be some, if you like, less consequential decision making that could be taken at that level. I'll use the example of a school. So, for instance, if we approach later on in the year and all the schools are back in place, if we see that there's an outbreak which is centred around about a school, it may be that local decisions are taken to deal with that and to exclude pupils from that school while that outbreak is managed. There will be other decisions which should remain at a national level in terms of our overall approach, but we're trying to develop data in a way and surveillance in a way that allows a much more informed view of what's happening across the country, recognising that sometimes, particularly when you've got outbreaks, it's not going to be a homogenous situation right across the country.
Thank you. That's all my questions, Convener. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And we'll go now to Shona Robson, please.
Good morning, panel. The Cabinet Secretary for Health has written to the committee this week about the Health Protection Coronavirus International Travel Scotland regulations, which came into force on Monday. And I just want to understand, obviously this is a four-nation approach requiring people to self-isolate for 14 days, but governments are already under pressure to relax these regulations even before they came into force. So how will the evidence be gathered to inform decisions on these quarantine measures going forward? Will it be stage or will we be looking also on a Scottish context around these measures? And I guess it's a question for either Dr. Smith or Professor Crossman.
Shall I make a start to this, and then Professor Crossman can come in as well? Clearly, when you're introducing any change to a system, you need to be able to assess that change and see whether it's had its intended impact as well. And that means looking at a range of measurements associated with that. Now, in relation to the quarantine of travellers who come into the UK, one of the things we need to consider is what's the existing pool of infection within the UK, what is our R number, and what's the likelihood any traveller coming into the UK is going to import infection as well. So that may vary depending on where that traveller has come from in the rest of the world as well. So over time, as the global picture begins to change, you might find that that approach itself needs to change as well as we consider the kind of evidence that comes through from that. Certainly the experience of many countries across the world as they've had reducing numbers of infections and that as they've started to control their own, if you like, domestic epidemic of cases and move to this kind of more sporadic outbreaks of cases, is that the experience has been that travellers can sometimes be responsible for the importation of those events. For instance, we know that our own experience in Scotland showed that at the beginning of our COVID experience that it was multiple importations, mainly from continental Europe, that introduced the disease at various points, well over 100 points across Scotland. And as our own numbers start to reduce, if there are countries that have higher levels of transmission and there's higher numbers of cases, then our risk begins to become greater at that point in time as well. So all these things we take into account, and the advisory structures primarily through SAGE, but also through our own advisory structures within Scotland. We'll be looking at the Scottish experience, the Scottish context in particular, and providing advice to ministers.
Okay.
Shall I come just build a little bit on that? I'll be very. Absolutely agree with that. It comes back to what I said earlier. This issue of is a rebound or whatever coming from our own population or new introductions, and this issue around border controls, quarantine, and so on and so forth is dealing with the issue of new introductions. How do you measure that? One of the things that it has been done, and I think will be increasingly important, is the forensic analysis of viral introductions, which you can do by measuring the genetic footprint of the individual viruses. This is the so-called viral genome sequencing. And because there are minor variations in the virus from around the world, you can actually fingerprint these. So there is scientific method that will be able to say whether a new case has been introduced from abroad or not. And I think that will be something very helpful for us in making policy around what's one of the most difficult issue, foreign travel, and how that's managed. I'll stop there.
Okay. Dr. Smith referred to international evidence, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about how we'll gather and learn from that international evidence. So the BBC referred to a case this week, I think it was the BBC, around a flight from Doha to Athens, where obviously the Greek government's trying to reopen its flights for their tourism industry. And everybody on that flight, I think 99 passengers were tested in Doha and tested negative. When they arrived in Athens and were retested, 12 of them tested positive for COVID-19, which I found quite an alarming case in itself. So will you and SAGE be looking at this international evidence, and how would you be able to manage that process? Because it would be impractical, presumably, to test everybody at both ends of a flight. But doesn't that one example show what a risk this is, and what advice would you be giving?
So I don't know the particular example that you've described there, Ms. Robertson, but what you've described there perfectly is the fact that testing is not the panacea to controlling the spread of this virus. It's helpful, we should use it, but we must understand its limitations as well. It's very dependent on the test being taken in the proper way, but it's also very dependent on the test being taken at the point in time when that person begins to shed virus. And I think what you've demonstrated there is that the circumstances by which false reassurance can sometimes be given by testing as well, and that's something we must always try to guard against. But what we'll be looking for in terms of the international evidence is actually approaches that other countries are adopting in terms of their border controls, how they're managing that influx of people, and particularly once they get to very low levels of transmissions within countries, what approach has worked in terms of reducing the number of external introductions of the virus into their population from alternative sources. Isolation is clearly one of the key mechanisms by which you can do that. A transition for anyone from one place to another should be associated with an isolation because of that incubation period, but that's only one way of many in terms of trying to manage it. And as I say, I think you're right in that we will be using the structures like SAGE to glean that evidence from other countries and see what can be applied across the UK.
Just finally on SAGE, I mean, is there any consideration being given to establishing a Scottish SAGE, or do you feel that the structures that we have and the advisory structures are adequate to look at all these issues, including issues like international travel, quarantine, from a Scottish perspective.
So I think that the SAGE structures offer us a huge well of expertise drawn from all 4 nations of the UK. And it's not just the SAGE group itself, it's the multiple subgroups of SAGE which are important. So whether that be NERTAG, SPI-M, SPI-B, which you mentioned the nosocomial group, the care homes group, these are all important powerhouses to either develop or consider the evidence that's emerging in relation to COVID-19. Where I think it's been really important for Scotland is to take that information and to be able to contextualise it for Scotland and be able to have our Scottish scientists who can use both their own evidence and some of the evidence that's emerging from these other structures, but apply it as is necessary to the unique Scottish context and population that we have, so that we can continually check and make sure that that evidence is as relevant here in Scotland as in the other 4 nations as well. I don't envisage that we'll go to a formal SAGE structure within Scotland in the future, but I think that what we must retain is our ability to be able to use our Scottish expertise and our Scottish advisors in a way that allows us to make sure that we're making the best decisions for the context that we have in Scotland. Over.
Okay, thank you, Shona. Can I, at this point, say thank you to our 3 witnesses this morning for their evidence to the committee. It's been very helpful. We've had a lot of detail, and I appreciate your time, particularly at this very busy period. The committee will now suspend for about 5 minutes to allow a break, and will then reconvene with our second panel. Thank you. Welcome back. We will continue with the evidence taking on options for easing the coronavirus lockdown restrictions. And I'm very pleased to welcome our second panel of witnesses this morning. We have Dr. Don McCaskill, who is Chief Executive of Scottish Care, and Susie Fitton, who is the Policy Officer at Inclusion Scotland. So welcome to you both. And I can remind members, if they're asking questions, if they can indicate to which witness they intend to address them. And I can just remind our witnesses, if when they're asked a question, if they just pause and take a breath before they answer, that will allow broadcasting enough time to switch the microphone on so we don't miss the first few words of your response. Can I start by putting a question to Susie Fitton, please, for Inclusion Scotland? And in your written submission, you say that during phase 1, some key public services, for example, respite care, children's hearings, and some key health programmes, will also begin to restart their work. But as yet, we've not had any details that I'm aware of as to when or how these services will restart, or how these services will be prioritised. So can I ask you, what are the services that you want to see prioritised, and why? And what timescale would you like to see these restarting?
So many of the services that disabled people rely on to support our daily living, so things like social care support, that would be the key service that many disabled people rely on to lead full and participative lives. We know that many disabled people have had their social care support at home stopped or reduced as a result of the responses to COVID-19. So we carried out a survey throughout April, and we surveyed 822 disabled people across Scotland about the impact of COVID-19 and the antivirus responses to it. And I'll be speaking to this evidence in more detail today, but this research uncovered that almost 30% of the respondents on this issue had had their care and support removed, and in certain situations that was leaving them bedbound or unable to wash themselves or go to the toilet or feed themselves without assistance from family members, many of whom hadn't received training or support. So the research uncovered a mental health crisis for disabled people, particularly disabled people who couldn't access services like mental health support, social care support, and respite support for carers and for individuals. And as a result of the reduction or the removal of social care support, 15 people told us directly that they were suicidal because of the lockdown restrictions and the fear of the virus and a feeling of being abandoned by statutory services. I kind of personally analysed this section of the survey and reading comments from single parents of 2 or more disabled children whose children were receiving 2-to-1 support previously, who were trying to cope with holding down full-time work, and trying to support their children in housing situations without a garden, disabled people who were shielding, who had pre-existing mental health problems that were triggered by anxiety and isolation, were not getting the mental health support that they needed and were stating very clearly that they wanted to end their lives. So it was very deeply affecting and brought home very clearly the impact of service closure and cuts to social care provision in terms of the impact on individuals. Literally hundreds of disabled people told us that they were being pushed to the brink in terms of their mental health. And this was particularly significant for disabled people with lived experience of mental illness made worse by isolation and anxiety about the future, and cancellation of medical appointments and therapeutic appointments. There's also a very large cohort of disabled people at high risk of the virus, but who didn't get a shielding letter. And they have struggled to access everyday essentials like food and medicine, and they're very anxious, obviously, about the resumption of services that you mention. Disabled people who live alone and who have limited social networks or find digital or remote communication difficult or impossible find it very difficult to access online mental health support. Parents of young or adult children with additional support needs who report very stressful experiences of being in lockdown at home. Now, this will have eased for some by the move into phase 1, but it will still be the case for those who are shielding or at high risk of the virus. Many of those parents of young or adult children are very keen that day services should resume in a safe way for disabled children. They're also very keen to emphasise the need for tailored support to parents who are caring for children with additional support needs at home who won't be able to go back to school when schools reopen because of their risk of the virus. Parents say that their disabled children, particularly those who are shielding, are at times exhibiting signs of distress in lockdown, such as self-harm or violent outbursts because of the disruption to their lives. One single parent of 2 disabled children described screaming into her pillow every night because her situation at home had become so frightening and intolerable. She told us that her child was hurting herself hourly and there was no obvious support for her. So we see that child and adolescent mental health support is absolutely crucial in terms of resuming services, and we see that many of these issues, so these underlying mental health issues, may well be with us way after lockdown and restrictions are eased. And so it's absolutely crucial that these services are funded and that mental health support that is provided by disabled people's organisations and other third sector organisations get the support and the funding that they require into the long term.
Thank you very much. I mean, that's a very comprehensive answer, and you touched on a whole range of issues. I know that other members of the committee want to explore some of this in more detail in a few moments. I wonder if I can turn and ask Donald McCaskill a couple of questions just to help set the scene. Donald, the Scottish Government's route map states that moving from phase 1 to phase 2 will depend on the WHO 6 criteria for easing restrictions being met. And this includes having sufficient public health and health system capacities in place to identify, isolate, test and treat all cases and to trace and quarantine contacts. Now, in your written submission to the committee, you raised a number of concerns about the Scottish Government's test and protect approach. And I wonder if you can update us on whether you think the situation has improved any since you submitted your written submission, and whether you think it would now be safe for the Scottish Government to move on to phase 2 with the test and protect system as it currently stands.
In our we see testing as being of great significance in terms of giving the confidence that the care home sector and the home care sector needs to move into beyond phase 1 into phase 2. There have, I think, been significant improvements in the testing of care home staff who were symptomatic and asymptomatic. There have been improvements in terms of the testing of residents in homes where there have been outbreaks, and I suspect that later today the data will illustrate that, but we share the Cabinet Secretary's concern that the pace, the consistency of that testing, particularly moving towards ideally 1 week testing for care home staff, is some distance away. And so the quick answer to your question is that at the moment, the care home sector isn't confident about us moving into phase 2. There are, in addition, concerns around the practicalities of test and protect and how that may impact on the social care sector. And we have been trying for some time to get a direct route into the testing staff and the operational element of that. So I think there still needs to be improvement in how the experience of social care staff, whether they be in the community or indeed in care homes, impacts and influences the testing strategy and its operationalisation.
Okay, thank you, Donald. Again, I think that other members want to come in and pursue some of these issues in more detail in a moment. But can I ask you a second question, which is about the issue of allowing visitors into care homes, which I'm sure all members will be familiar with this from constituents' correspondence, just how distressing it is that people have had relatives in care homes and not been able to visit them. And in your submission, you say that decisions around allowing visitors will be required to be taken at a local and individual service level, but there does require to be a national support and frameworks for establishing and clarifying when and how visits can take place, which recognise the realities and experiences of all parties. So, can you perhaps explain to us what you want to see addressed in a national framework that will enable care providers to develop their own local approaches to this issue?
Scottish Care, as well as providers, have been working with clinical staff at government to prepare guidance for visiting, and I would hope there would be an announcement on that and the process in the very near future. But I think it's fair to say, Convener, that there is very real fear in the sector. So care homes effectively went into lockdown 14 weeks ago tomorrow. That led to a complete unreality in our care home sector. They changed from being environments of enjoyment, experience, social encounter, to being environments of isolation, of detachment, and of silence. And that unreality has lived on and has had and is having a profound impact on the psychological and the physical well-being of some of our most vulnerable citizens. So if you're a care home which has been devastated by the virus, if you are a group of staff who have sat literally and had to say goodbye to your friends at a level and consistency which nobody should have to do, then you're very frightened of opening your home up to the possibility of that virus returning. If you're a care home which has been fortunate in not experiencing the virus, you're equally anxious about opening up to visiting. But I and others are constantly getting letters and communication for family who are desperate to reconnect, to get back in touch with their family member. And so we have to balance that safety and virus protection against the need to restore relationship and against the need to attend to the psychological health of individuals. I think at times, and this is throughout care home response in the UK, we have erred too much on infection control and prevention. And at this stage, I think proportionately, we need to err and be more risky in the activities which we're prepared to permit.
Thank you. That's a very interesting response, and I can understand, for residents and homes who feel this isolation, perhaps they are more open to the idea of relaxing the restrictions than might have been the case even, a month or 2 months ago. Right, we will move on because I've got a large number of colleagues who want to come in with pursue some questions. And we'll start with Annabel Ewing, please. And after Annabel, it'll be Ross Greer.
Thank you, convener, and good morning, panel. I had a first question for Susie Fitton, just really in light of the very troubling evidence that she's given the committee this morning, and I would imagine that, of course, the committee's deliberations will very much be looked at by relevant ministers, and they would doubtless wish to pursue some of these matters. But just as really to check that my understanding of this is correct, as a point of information as well, of course, I think in about the second week of April, the Scottish Government announced that there would in fact be help for those people who fell out with the shielding group, but fell in within a number of other categories. I mean, I refer to these people as vulnerable in terms of my constituency caseload. And I know that many of these people who have contacted me in my constituency, who were disabled or fell within other subheadings, if you like, of this new category, did obtain help with getting essential food and medicine, and indeed being connected with other agencies. And of course, there is the national helpline, the 0800 111 4000 number. It was just really to ensure that the people whom Susie Fitton has been in contact with are aware that there is this help out there, and it's still ongoing.
So many people made clear to us at the beginning of April that they were struggling to get access to the food and medicine that they needed. Around 2/3 of those responding on this question said that they were struggling to access shops and pharmacies. We are aware of the specific helpline for disabled people who are struggling to get access to food and medicine. And it's extremely welcome that that's in place. I think in relation to the at-risk or what is deemed to be the vulnerable group, we would have some concern about the use of the term vulnerable as opposed to the term at-risk, because we believe that disabled people are not inherently vulnerable, but they are made vulnerable by responses to the crisis that don't include them. We would consider this group to be at risk of the virus, and we know that there has been Scottish Government's announcements of actions that aim to address some of the issues that are causing this cohort additional stress and anxiety. We also saw most recently the First Minister's commitment to not forgetting about the people who are shielding in Scotland, which is extremely welcome, given that that cohort includes many disabled people. But our view is that it's not obviously just people in the shielding group who need tailored advice. Many disabled people in the at-risk group came back to us to say that they're struggling to determine their risk from the virus because they cannot find accessible and impairment-specific health-related advice. So we would say that it is this at-risk group that also need tailored advice, this group that don't receive a shielding letter, because obviously what happens if they're called back to work in the later phases of recovery and renewal, but it's unsafe for them to do so, but that they don't have evidence of their risk factor in the form of a shielding letter, are they going to be able to get a fit note from the GP? Will they get paid leave or will they move on to statutory sick pay? What happens to those at-risk people when the furlough scheme ends? Will their jobs remain open, or will employers seek to lay these people off if they can't return to work in a feasible time? If an employer makes reasonable adjustments and makes the workplace safe, but somebody in the at-risk group but not shielding group believes that they are still at risk, will their contract of employment be frustrated? So we do urgently need specific and tailored advice for this cohort, in the same way that there is now a very welcome focus on the shielded group.
Susie Fitton for that answer, and certainly I will personally undertake to draw those comments to the attention of the relevant Scottish Government ministers. I did actually make reference to this, and I take your point, at-risk group yesterday in a speech I made in the Chamber, and I'll certainly undertake to do that. I'm sure Inclusion Scotland will continue to work closely, as they always have done, with the Scottish Government on that point, but it's a point well made, and thank you for raising that. The other question I have, if I may, Convener, is to Dr. McCaskill, and it's looking at this issue from a slightly different perspective. I have thought for some time that the care inspector actually don't have the powers that they need, in terms of where we are in the 21st century, and that was quite a bit before the pandemic. I just wonder, looking at the short, medium and longer term, does Dr. McCaskill feel that matters would be assisted by the beefing up of the powers of these care inspectorates in Scotland?
Comparative regulatory bodies across the UK and indeed continental Europe is that the care inspectorates have a range of powers, both of intervention, improvement and oversight, which is at the highest level. And I think the experience of many care providers in the community and indeed in care homes is that throughout this experience, unlike, may I say, regulators elsewhere, the care inspectorates have been extremely supportive, have intervened where there were clearly identified areas of risk and concern, have been in frequent contact through practical advice and guidance. The development of staffing an alert system early days of the pandemic has undoubtedly helped and prevented some of the worst excesses that we've seen, for instance, in Spain and parts of France. So I think what might lie behind some of the concern is the degree to which the relationship between in-reach health, and I mean primary and secondary health, has not been historically as adequate into our care home sector as it needs to be. And I and others have been on record for some time as saying that there has been a failure of the whole health and social care system to recognise the significant needs which our older and sometimes the most vulnerable population in care homes have. So I don't believe that the Care Inspectorate needs enhanced powers. I think the emergency powers are technical ones. And as I have communicated directly to the Cabinet Secretary and indeed in our submission to this committee, we were supportive of those emergency powers, but they were powers which lay open to the Cabinet Secretary and senior officials should they wish to have exercised them, regardless of the new legislation.
I thank Dr. McCaskill for his answer. I understand the point he's making in the last comment he made. I do feel that it would be quite a bold person that would say a particular organisation, regulatory body, didn't need another look at all in any respect. I would have thought issues about registration, issues about operational control, issues about large group ownership, issues where there's been a failure in the past, but the same people can come along and set up another care home. I would have thought actually that some of these issues would be worth looking at, but obviously the focus today is specifically on easing lockdown, so I'll perhaps let other colleagues have their shot now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Annabelle. Can I just make a couple of brief points? First of all, just remind witnesses that just take a pause before you start answering the question, otherwise we lose the first few words of your response. And secondly, we have got quite a lot to get through, so we try and keep answers as short as possible. That would be very helpful, although I appreciate there's a lot of detail in what you want to say. We will move on to Ross Greer, please, and after Ross it'll be Monica Lennon.
Thank you, Convener. I've got a couple of questions for Dr. McCaskill around the routine testing of care staff, or that being the policy. The numbers of tests conducted each day clearly suggest that that policy is not being implemented in practice, but that it's no longer entirely, at least, an issue of overall capacity. We have an overall capacity in Scotland to conduct something in the region of 15,000 tests a day, but often in recent days it's been 3,000 or 4,000 tests, including what should be routine testing of care home staff, testing of anyone in the population who's symptomatic, anyone over the age of 70 being admitted to hospital, etc. I'm wondering if you could give a little bit more detail on what the logistical barriers seem to still be for care homes accessing the routine testing of their staff, and if there are particular variations. Are there some health boards who are essentially achieving this and others who are not, or is there a consistent problem across the country here?
I'll start again. Testing we consider to be extremely important, and that's why on the 29th of April we asked for testing of all symptomatic residents and staff, testing of all asymptomatic staff and residents, though that latter one has not been achieved to date. And the announcements on the 1st of May and the 18th of May consolidated that position. Since then, what we have seen is across the 14 health boards in Scotland, a very diverse approach. So we have some health boards, and I could name one, but I would save their blushes, where there has been collaborative engagement, involvement with care homes in the area, where they have now completed all the tests of residents, all the tests of both asymptomatic and staff in what are come to be known as green and red and amber care homes, and are now back out on a routine measure doing this every week. So that shows it can be done. However, there are some health boards which even yesterday were just submitting their plans for activity. And again, I will not mention who they are, but no doubt the data which will be published today and in subsequent weeks will evidence where the levels of relative inability are. So we have not got this right. The care home sector has been asking, as has the Cabinet Secretary and First Minister, for us to get this right. And it is one of the key tools which will enable us to address the virus and its spread in our care homes. Because all this talk of recovery in the community is all very well, but for those of us working in the care home sector, we're still fighting this virus. We're not even contemplating recovery. And I had a care home manager yesterday on the phone, virtually in tears, about the fact that she was walking to work and everybody was getting back to normal. Nobody was socially distancing. Nobody was wearing masks when she went to her local supermarket. And it's almost as if the rest of the world is getting on with life and the care sector yet again seems to be forgotten. We must get testing right. There are clear reasons which we all understand why it's not working, and it's down to the health boards to get it right.
Thank you. And just one question to follow up on that about the test, trace and isolate approach and how that affects care homes. If we do quickly get to this point of the routine testing of care home staff, that will obviously result in more positive test results. And I'm interested in what the workforce implications are as a result of that. If a member of staff in a care home does test positive, and not only are they required to isolate, but the requirements of the test, trace and isolate approach would suggest that those around them, a significant number of other staff in that care home, would then be asked to isolate as well. Is the sector confident of workforce capacity? If test, trace and isolate is to get up and running effectively and quickly, this could happen to a number of homes, particularly in concentrated areas, in rapid succession. Is there enough workforce flexibility there to cope with that?
So partly through the tool developed by the Care Inspectorate, partly through the enhanced support through Directors of Nursing and Public Health, there are resilience plans being drawn up for each care home in each health board area, so that if the testing results in a significant loss of workforce, those can be met. To date, even whole home testing has not evidenced the significant and the highest level of loss of workforce than might have been feared. Clearly, as we move into test and protect, and this becomes a wider issue for the whole of the community, some of our concerns are that we must prioritise social care staff. For instance, in a household where a member of family has been tested positive, we must provide enhanced and focused support to enable the care home worker or home care worker to be tested as quickly as practicable so that they can return to work. We don't have the degree of clarity as the process to enable that to happen, and that's something that we're working with colleagues in health boards and government to make sure that the test and protect system fits in and contributes to the overall testing of care homes and others.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. Next call, Monica Lennon, please, and after Monica, it'll be Stuart Stevens.
Thank you, Convener. If I can start with Susie Fitton, first of all, and thank you for your very comprehensive opening remarks and your answers so far. The survey that you've mentioned is very concerning. Can I pick up on the issues around children in particular? In your written submission, you highlight children with additional support needs and the care and particular needs that they have, especially what they're missing out on when they're not at school. Can you say more about what you would like to see in the route map or in the lockdown easement plans for children and young people in particular? And can you say something about the impact on disabled children who are shielding and who have not had contact with other children and young people? What are you concerned about the long-term impact of that?
So parents of disabled children, particularly children with neurodivergence, so autism and ADHD and other conditions that mean that disruption to routine and reduction in activity, so structured activity during the day, is leading to some very, very difficult situations for parents of disabled children in lockdown at home. So we received reports of self-harm, challenging behaviour, continuous meltdowns, and this is particularly difficult for children who can't understand social distancing and who can't understand the disruption to their routine, people with young people with communication impairments, and children who find it difficult to express how they feel at this time. We are finding families are under particular pressure in this area. We would like to see the emergence from lockdown prioritising reopening the support services that disabled people, that disabled children and young people need. So we would like to see, obviously, the resumption of day centre provision. I cannot stress this enough, though. Many parents of disabled children were reporting that their care packages at home for their children had been reduced or stopped completely. We saw 30% of responses to that question on social care at home coming from people whose care had been stopped or removed. And so I cannot stress enough the need for local authorities to reinstate the social care support that young people receive at home, and ensure that PPE is getting to parents and families who are providing care for their young person at home, particularly if that person is in the shielding group. So we've obviously seen a very welcome focus on providing PPE to disabled people who have personal assistants who support them in the home. We've seen targeted provision of PPE in that area, so I believe there are hubs that people can actually access that PPE, but we need that same approach to be extended to families of disabled children where that child is shielding. I think it's absolutely vital when we move into the recovery and renewal phase and we see schools opening in August, that we makes appropriate and inclusive decisions about how disabled children with additional support needs are supported to go back to school effectively, and what we do for families when their children cannot go back to school because of the risk of the virus. So many parents of young people have reported to us that homeschooling just isn't an option for them for many reasons, because they're not receiving the ASN support at home, obviously, that their child received in school. And many parents report to us that they simply cannot replicate at home the kind of support that they received in school, that their child received in school. And so obviously there's a really significant risk here that we will be exacerbating inequality in terms of attainment. Children with ASN in Scotland already face a significant attainment gap in relation to non-disabled children. So there are real kind of issues here. We need the Scottish Government to take into account the long-term impact of lockdown on mental health for parents of disabled children. We need some acknowledgement that many disabled children cannot follow social distancing rules. So we saw a degree of flexibility being shown by the Scottish Government in terms of their guidance on social distancing slightly earlier in the lockdown. There was an acknowledgement that maybe young people with autism or with other conditions that made it very important that they take regular exercise in wide open spaces. So we were in the early part of the lockdown, parents of disabled children were reporting to us that they simply couldn't exercise their children, because if they took them out in the local area, they weren't able to go to the parks and the open space that their children had previously needed to exercise in. So we did see some flexibility in relation to that, but what we need to see going forward is an acknowledgement that some disabled children cannot follow social distancing rules. And I mean, I don't have an easy answer to that, but I think we need to acknowledge it. I think we also need to acknowledge that families of disabled children and children with additional support needs are under particular pressure because of the closure of leisure centres. Swimming is a therapeutic activity for many of these children, and also for adults. I know your question related to younger disabled people, but therapeutic exercise is also extremely important for disabled adults, and particularly those managing pain conditions. And so we would like the easing of restrictions to prioritise the opening, maybe at priority times or at particular times for disabled people who need to take a therapeutic exercise. We're seeing disabled people reporting a significant increase in pain, which is impacting on mental health conditions and mental health reactions to the crisis. And we know that therapeutic exercise is extremely important for many disabled people. So if we're going to look at a phased return in terms of local authority provision, we would like to see a specific attention paid to opening swimming pools for people who previously received therapeutic therapy, things like hydrotherapy, things like physiotherapy, that they can no longer get, and so therapeutic exercise is extremely important.
Thank you very much, Susie. I had a number of supplementary questions, but I think you've covered a lot of ground in your answers, and that will be on the record now, and I'm sure that ministers will be listening very carefully too. So I'll move on to Dr. McCaskill in terms of Scottish care and care homes. Dr. McCaskill, if I can first of all ask about sick pay for staff. I've had a number of people get in touch who are still not able to access full sick pay, and some of them have had to self-isolate and be off work and have experienced financial detriment. Can you give us an update in terms of your members, how many of them offer full sick pay as a benefit, and how are your discussions with the government going in terms of the support that government may provide to staff and care homes in that regard?
Can I just intervene for a second, Dr. McCaskill, before you come in? I think we need to remember the focus for these questions are on easing lockdown restrictions. And I think we have to be slightly careful we're not straying into the territory of, for example, the Health and Sport Committee. You might want to pursue these sort of questions. So by all means answer the question, Dr. McCaskill, but I'll just say to Monica, just bear in mind we're meant to be looking at lockdown, not at these other wider issues.
So very quickly to Ms Lennon's question, we are having very constructive discussions with the trade unions, with COSLA and the Scottish Government. I believe that a final settlement of these issues should be reached by COSLA leaders later on this week. There have been a number of very purposeful meetings this week. Ms Lennon and other members of the panel will know that the vast majority of social care in Scotland is paid to providers, be they charitable, not-for-profit or private providers, by the state, by local authorities and Scottish Government. The National Care Home Contract, which keeps costs defined, does not allow providers to pay enhanced terms in terms of statutory sick pay. Clearly, organisations like ourselves have been asking for a change in that for years, but it is both national and local politicians that have prevented that from being operationalised.
I'm grateful to Donald McCaskill for his answer. He did say in his earlier evidence that the crisis in care homes is far from over. We know that testing is critical to moving forward, and we know that the fear around debt has been a huge barrier to some staff in accessing testing. Can I ask about the really important issue about the resumption of visitation? And I know that I think over 60% of care home residents have dementia. It's been a huge issue that's been raised by the general public. Can I ask Dr. McCaskill, in terms of PPE and current access, do you see a need for a change in the current guidance, so that if people start to visit care homes again, that they should, as a matter of course, be wearing PPE, and is that something that, I know it's part of the lockdown plan or the route map plan, but do we need to see a change in guidance on PPE so that everyone working in a care home or visiting a care home has access to suitable PPE and is wearing it as much as possible? Thank you.
So every staff member should have access to PPE. We have worked very closely with Scottish Government and NSS to ensure that is the case, despite the global challenges of getting access to PPE. In terms of our move towards visiting, almost certainly visiting will have to take place, first of all, outside, and then over a period of time, gradually inside a care home. And almost certainly, family members will need to wear an appropriate level of PPE. And we're working with colleagues to ensure that there is sufficiency of supply for that PPE. And even that's difficult. I think more than anything else, this is what troubles me about the last few weeks. We have had thousands of individuals locked away from their family, their friends and their community. People who used to pop in at different times of the day are now not able to see their relatives except through windows. So the sooner we can restore that relationship, the better. But we have to balance it with keeping people safe. So PPE is one of the critical mechanisms to enable that to happen. And we're very clear, Scottish Care said on the 29th of April, that we believe that universal wearing of masks is necessary in all care encounters. And I believe and expect that we will move to that over the next period of time. We need to protect visitors, we need to protect the wider community, but we must, most of all, need to protect the residents. But protection has to include restoration of relationship.
Thank you. Just a very brief supplementary. Can I just clarify, when you say masks, are you talking about medical masks or do you mean face coverings, or is it a bit of both? And I've got no further questions, Convener.
It will be a bit of both depending on the context of the person visited. So if somebody is at end of life and is COVID, then the person who visits and unfortunately has to wear fairly full PPE, including a medical mask. And that has happened, it is happening, and it's challenging and difficult, but it's better than absence.
Okay, thank you, Monica. I'll move on to Stuart Stevenson, please. And after Stuart, it'll be Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you very much, Convener, and my question is directed initially to Dr. Donald McCaskill. But before I do that, I should make a couple of declarations. Firstly, I have a very close family relative who occupies a senior position in a care home, albeit that they are currently not working there because they're shielding. And of course, secondly, because I'm over 70, I'm categorised as vulnerable. I don't think any of that matters, but it's important just to make that point. I just want to ask Dr. McCaskill why so many care homes have actually done extremely well through this and kept infection beyond their doors. We've heard a lot about the problems, we've heard rather less about the successes, and I think it's always good to try and success wherever we can, but more importantly, to learn from why those successes were successes and what lessons there are from those successes that we can apply right across the industry, so that as we move forward with reducing our lockdown measures, we take the best possible path for care homes. Dr. McCaskill.
So I think that's a very complicated question. It's one which clearly exercises the care home sector, it exercises the Cabinet Secretary and the clinical group concerned with care homes. It's a question we're not just asking in Scotland, but elsewhere. So we are getting evidence that one of the things that influence this is the size of the care home. Clearly, many of our care homes are residential rather than nursing, so there's a different community and a different level of need in terms of a residential compared to a nursing care home. There are some care homes where staff very sacrificially have moved in to live in the care home. There are other instances and data that's been published which we also need to explore. So, for instance, 9% of those who've tragically died in our hospitals came from care homes in Scotland, but the comparative figure in England is 27%. So what was happening there at different stages of the pandemic? All of us involved in the care of citizens, whether it be the frontline nurse, the manager of a care home, the operator of a care home, we want to learn the lessons in order to protect people. We're still learning those lessons. We are absolutely convinced that PPE, the quick access to PPE enabled by the Scottish Government, the early lockdown of care homes have both assisted in controlling and in managing the virus. Testing is the next arm in that process, and we need to get that right. But as we move forward, all of us will be reflecting on whether we did what we could have done, whether the lessons that we now know need to be intrinsically at the heart of any future response.
Thank you, Stuart. We'll move on to Beatrice Wishart, please. And after Beatrice, it'll be Shona Robeson.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I wonder if I could ask Susie Filton. I mean, I've been quite impressed with the work that you've done, and I'm horrified at some of the information that has come out in the survey as well, and your answers to other colleagues. So, and obviously the increased pressure on disabled people and their families has been highlighted, for example, with the 64%, I think it was, who indicated in your survey that they were struggling to access food and medicine. So just could you give an understanding, I know you've touched a little bit on this before, but if that's still the case, and how the easing of lockdown restrictions could affect the disabled people and families.
So I'll start again, actually, sorry. It's so tempting to answer too quickly. So just to outline the key pressures on disabled people at the moment. So I've talked before about the fact that social care support has been stopped or reduced. Disabled people have new or increased caring responsibilities. So about 40% of disabled people who responded to this question to us are experiencing challenges with caring for children or family members since the start of the pandemic. So you've got a reduction or complete removal of support. You've got suddenly the acquisition of new or increased caring responsibilities. You mentioned disabled people are struggling to get access to food and medicine. I think I mentioned before that there has been a response to this from the Scottish Government and from local authorities. And we will have to follow this issue throughout the recovery and the renewal phase to see whether or not disabled people are still struggling to get access to the food and medicine that they need, to the extent that they reported to us in April. 64% said that they weren't able to access the food or medicine that they needed. And just to talk about that in slightly more detail. So one of the things that we were finding was that the systems for supporting disabled people with food, with accessing food and medicine, that many of these systems were inaccessible, and the processes that were put in place to support access to food, particularly, were not accessible to disabled people and were put in place without consulting disabled people. So initiatives like vulnerable shopper lists were creating extreme anxiety for many disabled people who were at high risk but not in the shielding group, and so they were unable to get themselves added to the list, particularly in the early stages of lockdown. Many disabled people had been already reliant on food deliveries to their home because of the inaccessibility of the built environment, or because of other impairment-related issues. So they were long used to not being able to get to the shops. What they weren't used to is suddenly having a complete inability to secure delivery slots or receive tailored support with shopping from local initiatives. In terms of accessing medicine, we found that many respondents described experiencing significant delays getting their medication, including insulin, very worrying, B12 injections and pain relief. Reasons given were that chemists were unable to dispense their medication, or appointments for medication to be administered were cancelled, and pharmacists dispensing they were dispensing smaller amounts of medication, and there are obviously significant difficulties for many disabled people in actually getting to the pharmacy. So I would say in such circumstances, if a further lockdown was initiated because of a second wave or even a third wave of infection of the virus, without sufficient measures in place to ensure disabled people's access to food and vital medicine, then a further potentially larger crisis could result. So we would argue that involvement of disabled people in their organisations in emergency planning is absolutely vital to ensure that we don't see further issues with food and medicine. We will keep an eye on this issue. We know that there have been efforts to address it. We commend supermarkets for priority shopping hours. We've had less positive responses from disabled people about their experiences in supermarkets. People with communication support needs, people with sensory impairments report not being able to communicate with very easily with supermarket staff because of the necessity for staff to wear masks. Masks are obviously a real impediment to disabled people who need to lip read, for example. We know that social distancing within supermarkets is particularly difficult for many disabled people. People with mobility impairments find it very difficult to queue for long periods of time. People with sensory impairments find it very difficult to know where in the shop they can go unless they have a sighted guide. That proved very difficult for some disabled people when only one individual was allowed in the shop at the same time. So we've got reports from disabled people that they received less welcoming statements from staff in terms of meeting their access needs. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of ensuring that the results that we reported towards the beginning of April about access to food and medicine, that we see a real improvement as we emerge from this crisis.
Thank you, Susie. You've actually probably preempted what my next question was going to be, is, you know, if there was a second wave, but you've already highlighted to others about we need the reinstatement of social care at home and to prioritise the reopening of daycare services, and you've highlighted also the long-term impact of lockdown on mental health services. So the urgency is to get those in place, and obviously we hope there won't be a second wave, but if there is, do you think that the scenario would be a bit different from what we went into in March, April?
Sorry, I always tend to jump in. Let me start again. I think it's clear that there has been some excellent response to many of the issues that we raised in the initial findings of our survey. I think the Scottish Government, I commend the Scottish Government for their clarity of message. Perhaps the only significant omission for us is disabled people at high risk who are not classed as shielding. As I've mentioned before, I think this cohort of disabled people is actually much larger than the shielding group. It includes older people, people over 70, people over 60 with hypertension, people with diabetes, people with blood disorders. So it could be up to 1 million people who are at risk of the virus. So these people need a similar focus, and we need We need to think about the advice and the guidance that we give them. We need to think about the impairment-specific guidance that we give to disabled people. Will the response be different? I think we have learned a great deal in terms of where we are now. I think we've started to learn what works and what doesn't. We warmly welcome the very clear commitment to human rights within the route map that the Scottish Government have produced, equality and social justice, as we consider options to relax restrictions. I think what we need to be clear about, and this is one of the reasons that we surveyed people in the first place, we wanted to make sure that we were gathering experiences from disabled people actually on the ground, is there can at times be a gap between very positive policy intention and disabled people's experience on the ground. Now, this is probably most stark in relation to the provision of social care support, because we saw the Health Minister announced that local authorities should not be cutting back on care in this crisis, and that there was a commitment for further investment in social care support, ring-fenced money to support the sector in times of crisis. But we are still hearing from disabled people who are having their packages of care removed, and so it is absolutely crucial that disabled people are told when this care will be reinstated. There's a distinct lack of trust from disabled people that their care will ever be reinstated. I think many of you will be aware from your constituency work that disabled people face extreme frustration and barriers in terms of the assessment process for social care support and actually getting the support that they need. So there is a lack of trust that this care, in fact, will be reinstated at some point. So I think we would like some reassurances in this regard.
Okay, thank you, Beatrice. We'll move on to Shona Robeson, please, and after Shona, it'll be Willie Coffey.
Thank you, and good morning, panel. The question I had for Donald McCaskill has been asked, so I'll just ask briefly of Susie Bitten. Susie, in your evidence, you've really confirmed that those most at risk from the virus are also those most at risk of the consequences of lockdown. So as lockdown eases, and you've given a lot of evidence this morning around the priorities that you see for those that you represent and that you're in contact with, and you talked a fair bit about day services and support services resuming in a safe manner. And I just wanted to ask you, that is important. If families are going to have confidence in those services, they have to believe that they're safe. So how much contact and consultation are you aware of that is happening with those families around what a safe manner will mean? Because it seems to me logical that there would be consultation and partnership and rebuilding some of those services in a different way that have the confidence of the families using them. So what are you aware of that happening?
So I'm aware that I've been made aware recently that other third sector organisations are looking to consult their members about the resumption of daycare services, particularly for adults with learning disability. I know, for example, that the Scottish Commission on Learning Disability is looking to involve us, but also other stakeholders and parents and families in this. But to my knowledge, that's my only knowledge of an effort to involve parents and families in how services resume and how day centre services resume safely. Now, I think this is actually an overarching point for us, and a key issue for us is the long-term sustained investment in involvement. So disabled people need to be involved in the planning. We need to be involved in the emergence from COVID-19. We have worked for a long time to establish models whereby disabled people can be involved in the development of policy. We have people-led policy panels, for example, that have very effectively influenced the direction of adult social care reform in Scotland by working with the Scottish Government and with COSLA and with other partners. So that's a panel of 50 disabled people with different experiences of social care support. It includes older people, it includes people with a variety of experiences, so service users who have over an extended period given, they've effectively drawn up a blueprint for adult social care reform. We've seen experience panels influence the direction of travel in relation to the new social security system in Scotland. So we've seen models whereby the involvement of disabled people has led to the development of policy that meets their needs. And I think this form of involvement is absolutely crucial here. So parents of young disabled people need to be consulted in a time frame that allows them to respond, in an accessible way that allows them to respond, and in a way that is not going to increase their anxiety and fear, because there will be significant anxiety about disabled young people returning to services. So many disabled people and many parents of disabled young people and many disabled parents of disabled young people are in a real catch-22 at the moment, because there's a pressure cooker within the house in terms of the multiple demands that have been made on parents in terms of care, in terms of homeschooling, in terms of their own work commitments, and managing the anxieties and the stress around that. So many of them will be extremely keen for day centre services to reopen. What we need to find out is what they consider to be safe provision in this context. And I think I'm not aware that there's any wholesale efforts to consult families in this area. I mean, we will certainly investigate that and come back to you if you would like specific information on this. But what I would say is that involvement of these families is crucial. And we are very keen to assist in terms of making sure that these views are actually gathered appropriately and that they influence decision making in this area.
Okay, thank you to Shona. And we will move on to the last questioner, which is Willie Coffey, please.
Thanks very much, Murdo. I've only got the one question, and it's for Dr. McCaskill, if I can, please. Dr. McCaskill, I presume the whole testing policy will carry on for as long as it has to, as we move through the different phases of easing up the lockdown, and I mean that in the respect of care homes. What I wanted to ask you was, I've heard from some local people about the symptoms of this virus amongst our patients who have dementia, and sometimes it can be observed amongst those patients behavioural changes, perhaps as an indicator of the presence of the virus. Is that something you're familiar with? Is there any clinical evidence to support that? And would that influence your testing policy going forward, particularly in the care homes and particularly amongst our patients with dementia?
Thank you for that question. And the quick answer is yes. The way in which this pernicious virus presents itself to older individuals per se, but particularly to people living with dementia. And we now know that probably in excess of 85% of people in our care homes are living with dementia at some stage. It's a much higher figure than we had previously thought. We know that the way it presents is very different to the classic symptoms which we've all grown used to: the persistent cough, the loss of taste and smell, etc. So there are mood changes. There are which is difficult to determine because the whole process of lockdown has resulted in the change of moods of individuals, people who quite literally have turned their face to the wall, who've gone into themselves. So there are changes in mood. People go off their food. people present differently in terms of their general health with regards to aspiration, with bowels, etc. So there is a lot of gathering evidence to show that this pernicious virus presents differently to its most vulnerable population. That's been determined internationally. I know that Professor Graham Ellis from the Chief Medical Office is doing a lot of work in this area to work with the sector so that we are better able to identify the early stages of when an individual unfortunately has developed the virus. That will impact on testing, and testing will remain. I think the interesting thing which we need to begin to explore is the presentation of the virus with people living with dementia in their own homes in the community. I think that's the next battleground against this virus. We have a highly vulnerable population being cared for in their own homes, and we need to turn our focus increasingly to that very, very vulnerable group of individuals.
Thank you very much for that. I think it's really important to get that message. Convener, thank you for that.
Okay, thank you. I think that is through our questions for this morning. Can I thank our two witnesses for their time and coming along and answering our questions so comprehensively. The next meeting of the committee will be a week today, and we will have another panel giving evidence on easing lockdown restrictions. But for now, I close this meeting of the committee. Thank you.